Welcome back to Northwest Elite Spirit. I'm Coach Brian. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do that now, and you can have access to all of my videos on the lessons from Don Juan, my meditation practices, my visualization practices, my physical practices, and even my self-hypnosis practices. Now this video is part 2 from Success in Hunting, how to get what you want out of life, and this is learning to hunt, my take on learning to hunt. In the last video, Don Juan had realized that his approach to teaching Carlos how to change his ways and to learn something from Don Juan, Don Juan had been going about it all wrong. And he comes to this in an instant. So they've been sitting there for a while, and Carlos was absorbed in taking his notes, and Don Juan bolts up and he says suddenly, "You have a knack for hunting, and that's what you should learn, hunting." And I think this demonstrates Don Juan's ability to learn and adapt. He realized that Carlos had a knack for hunting, and right then and there decided that that's how he should teach Carlos. And I think this goes towards great teachers. Great teachers adapt through learning or through being good students themselves. And through Don Juan's experiences with Carlos, Don Juan learned that Carlos was a hunter. And so he's going to adjust his teachings to try to pull something out of Carlos through that. And so immediately they go out and they start hunting rattlesnakes. And they go in every direction. They go all over looking for rattlesnakes. And Don Juan is elaborating everything he's showing Carlos and teaching Carlos as they go. And Carlos becomes so absorbed in the experience that he forgets about everything else. And again, I think Don Juan he's demonstrating his ability as a teacher. Carlos forgot about everything in the ordinary world and became completely absorbed with the learning. So much so that he didn't even realize he was learning. And that's kind of like how I approach, I've coached a lot of kids teams, and I give them games and I give them things to do that when they would show up to the games, they would just perform. And everybody would be surprised at how well they performed when it looked like we were just playing games. But the games were so absorbing that the kids were learning and they didn't even know it. And even the parents watching wouldn't even know it until come game time. And then they would see the results. And then, so after they're done with all this learning, Don Juan finds a snake, cuts its head off, skins it, and prepares it, and he feeds it to Carlos. And Carlos, though he says the meat is delicious, his body rejects it. And I think it's funny how apt Carlos is to reject reality, like even when something is enjoyable. The meat was good, yet his body was trying to reject it. And I think that's because of a hang-up in his mind. And we all have hang-ups like that, right? Where something just seems like it should be wrong, and though it isn't, we reject it anyway. And Carlos's personality is full of hang-ups, supposedly based on reality, yet faced with reality, like how good this meat is, he's triggered, even physically. And it's expressed through his reaction to the snake, or even how easily he gets irritated or angry along the storyline. Carlos is always having reactions to reality. And then so afterwards they sit down and Carlos starts looking at his notes, and he's realizing how much he learned in such a short period of time. And again, Don Juan is such a great teacher that Carlos didn't even realize he was learning so much. And that's what I strive for as a teacher. And even as when I'm learning, I like to become absorbed in what I'm learning, and it's like a way of life rather than like you go to school and it's like separate from life. You have like your home life and you have your school life. And I like the way I learned to be my way of life, to where it just all blends together. And this kind of goes into that. So Don Juan says, hunters will always hunt. First he says Carlos is hooked. Carlos wants to know how he's hooked. And Don Juan says, hunters will always hunt. And I am a hunter myself. Carlos asks, do you mean you hunt for a living? He says, I hunt in order to live. I can live off the land anywhere. And he indicates the whole surroundings with his hand. And so there's a difference between, a big difference between doing something for a living and doing something to live. So if you hunt for a living, then it's not the same as hunting to live. I think one is far more serious than the other. Maybe we can get into something about that another time. And he says, to be a hunter means one knows a great deal. It means you can see the world in different ways. And you must have a perfect balance with everything else. So you do have to know a great deal to be a hunter. You have to know seasons and tides. You have to know animals' attitudes and patterns, how they respond to what. You have to know what they like and where they are likely to be. You have to know how to be patient, but also how to act swiftly when the time arises. And move. You have to be able to move swiftly or be still. And you also have to know, I know this through, I have a cousin, he took a guy hunting, and the guy fell. He hadn't been out in the woods much, and when he fell, he stuck a stick through, he fell and a branch went through his nose. And so you have to be nimble-footed and keep yourself from injury, but also prevent exposure to the elements. It gets cold or it gets hot, and that can, you can die from those sorts of things. So you have to know that as a means to be a hunter. And so Don Juan's going all these things that you have to know a balance. And like he says, all in all, we and snakes are on par. One of them fed us today. And Carlos says, I've never conceived of a balance like that when I used to hunt. And Don Juan says, that's not true. You didn't just kill animals. You and your family all ate the game. So Carlos didn't just go out to kill indiscriminately. There were reasons for what he was doing. And so when Carlos says, I had never conceived of a balance of that kind when I used to hunt, it's strange how many statements Carlos makes with conviction that if you just look at them a little closer, they're totally untrue, and he doesn't even believe them. He had conceived of a balance, and likely had conceived of it plenty of times. And so Carlos asks, how did you know that? Carlos is always trying to deny, and we all do it too. We're always like trying to get away from the reality of things for one reason or another. And Don Juan says, there's certain things that I just know, he said. I can't tell you how though. And maybe Don Juan is some sort of psychic or something, or maybe he just has a keen eye for the obvious, or maybe it doesn't even really take a keen eye to observe the obvious. Maybe it's just a matter of not ignoring the obvious and avoiding conversation about the obvious, or going along with storylines away from the obvious. A lot of times someone around us will be pretending away from what is obvious, and then we just go along, and then somehow that becomes a story, and everybody's ignoring the obvious. And I think Don Juan is opposite of that. He goes away from that. And then he goes into why he thinks he's a hunter. He says, I really think you have a touch for hunting. And we've been barking up the wrong tree. And he says because when he gave him a task on his porch earlier where Carlos was to find a spot that was beneficial to him, Carlos was able to see the colors of the spot and feel out the spot. And Don Juan says that is the sign of a hunter. You'll have to read the books or maybe go back further in my videos to see what I'm talking about there. But that's what gives him, it's like something that happened a long time ago has sparked an idea for Don Juan. And then Carlos says, to be a hunter sounded very nice and romantic, but it was an absurdity to me since I did not particularly care to hunt. And I think that's untrue. He's out here right now hunting for information. He's hunting for plants. He had to hunt for somebody to perhaps share the information with him. The plants don't just sprout up at your feet where you are in your office or in the classroom. You have to go out and hunt for them. And so, like I said, Carlos and many of us have this need to argue against reality. Very strange. And then it says, I had the feeling that Don Juan is capable of arguing his way out of anything. And he says that because he says you don't have to care to hunt or even like it. You have a natural inclination. I think the best hunters never like hunting. They do it well, that's all. And then Carlos says, I feel he was capable of arguing his way out of anything, and yet he maintained that he did not like to talk. So here I think Carlos gives a hint of one of the things he holds valuable, even though it's not valuable. It's like sand in your hands, and it's the ability to argue or to debate. I think many people think being able to argue or debate is somehow valuable, and I disagree with that. I think there's reality and there's not reality. And of course there's different perspectives, but it's all perspectives on reality. Oh, and he says it's not like what I told you about hunters, it is like what I told you about hunters. I don't necessarily like to talk. I just have a knack for it and do it well. That's all. And Carlos says, I found his mental agility truly funny. So again, he doesn't value himself or have such pride in his abilities like that. Like he can speak and he can speak well, and he has agility in his thought process, but it's not something that he's boastful about. It's just what is, and that's all. And he says hunters have to be exceptionally type individuals, Don Juan. And they must know many things. So all those things I went over that they must know. Not only must they know them, but they must stick to them. Because if you get away from those things, you don't have success in the hunt. So if you know the tides, or you know the patterns, and you know the traits, and you know the instincts, and you know what they like and dislike and where they are, you're not going to look for an animal where it wouldn't be, right? So that's what I mean by being tight. You do the things you know you're supposed to do, and that's how you have success. And then he goes on to, start telling him that he's a hunter. But Carlos, again, is protesting that he doesn't want to be a hunter. And even that, he isn't even so sure that he wanted to hunt or look for plants or learn about plants in the beginning. And Don Juan says, good, really good. If you don't have such a clear picture of what you want, you may become more humble. And though having a clear picture of what you want is, I think, is a good thing, Carlos just pretends to have a good picture of what he wants, and he's very prideful of it. And then Don Juan says, for your purposes, it doesn't really matter whether you learn about plants or about hunting. You've told me that yourself. You are interested in anything that anyone can tell you. True? And Carlos goes on to explain that that's what he said when they first met, but he didn't really mean it. And Carlos's intent to manipulate Don Juan in this situation is put him in a bind. Again, reality versus this fake world, this pretend world that Carlos lives in. And oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Like how far down the road do we go after we've lied to somebody, and how long do they pretend along with you? Good thing for Don Juan and Carlos here that Don Juan never pretended along with Carlos. He let Carlos come along, and he even let Carlos keep pretending, and that's kind of where they clash, and where Carlos gets all his irritation and his anger and his frustration, is that Don Juan not once pretends along with him. And so he says, I'm a hunter, and Don Juan leaves little to chance, and now he's trying to help Carlos, and that he knows what he's talking about because somebody taught him all this. He didn't figure it out for himself. Carlos asked if he had a teacher. He said, let's say that someone taught me to hunt the way I'm teaching you now. And I dig this, and so Carlos has to change. And I dig this because I still feel I have to change. I have not been a good hunter as far as finances go. And I need to change. I'm good at a lot of things, and I feel I can, or I know I can garner finances and be good at it. And I haven't figured out how, and this YouTube stuff is part of it, and even these Don Juan videos is part of it. Like, I'm learning from Don Juan and practicing these things while, at YouTube, so hunting finances through YouTube. And I'm also out here, learning. So, like, I'm joining groups, and I'm watching videos, and I'm finding mentors to help me learn how to hunt finances here on YouTube and in other aspects. And then he goes on to say, I think once upon a time, hunting was one of the greatest acts a man could perform. All hunters were powerful men. In fact, a hunter had to be powerful to begin with in order to withstand the rigors of life. And Carlos doing his thing again, he's like, he wants to know when. Like, there was a time when hunting was important and hunters were powerful. When? Was it before the conquest? And he begins to probe him. When is the time you're talking about? Once upon a time, Don Juan answers. What does once upon a time mean? It means once upon a time, or maybe it means now, today. It doesn't matter. At one time, everybody knew that a hunter was the best of men. Now, not everyone knows that, but there are sufficient number of people who do. I know it. Someday you will. See what I mean? And I think men are still hunters, and those who gain the most resources in life are still the most valued. Maybe not the most respected, but certainly valued. Like, they might not respect you, but they will certainly use you and try to get what they need out of you, whether they show you respect during that or not. I don't know if there was a time when people showed the hunters more respect. Maybe when hunting, if there was not a successful hunt, everybody died. Now, like, people, you have welfare, or you can, I don't know, find a sugar daddy or something. Like, there's more ways that you could survive without having a hunter in your life, I think. And in the other days, hunters got food from animals by way of meat, clothing from an animal by way of pelt, and tools from an animal by way of the bones and tendons. And we still need and value those things: food, clothing, and tools. And so hunters are still valued. Like I said, maybe not respected, and maybe people don't really understand the value of they don't understand, like, why they maybe value it or why they are needed. I don't know. Maybe I'll give that some more thought. And so Carlos is probing him, like, do the Yaqui Indians feel that way? The Pima Indians, and on and on. And he named various groups, and he says Don Juan was avoiding the question, but, like, again, Carlos is dancing around the obvious. Hunters are valued, and that's that. There's no need to commit a statement about, like, what group or what timeline. That gets away from the point, and saying maybe Don Juan was avoiding the topic, but it's like, it's not an important topic, so it wasn't like avoiding because he didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. It was just not important. Carlos does a lot of that. I haven't gotten further in the books. Maybe it cools off as far as that later on in some later books. I don't know yet. And he says, why are you doing this all for me? I'm having a gesture with you, Other people have had a similar gesture. Someday you will yourself have the same gesture with others. Let's say that it is my turn. One day I found out that if I wanted to be a hunter worthy of self-respect, I had to change my life. And I feel this way now. I've had a good life, but I've squandered a lot of opportunities, and I haven't gathered the things that I need for my family's long-term sustainability. So I'm changing that way now, the way I perceive things now, and putting on the eyes and attitude of a hunter, based on what I've learned. And Don Juan says, I used to complain a great deal, whine and complain a great deal. I had a good reasons to feel shortchanged. I'm an Indian, and Indians are treated like dogs. There was nothing I could do to remedy that, so all I was left with was my sorrow. But then my good fortune spared me, and someone taught me to hunt. And I realized that the way I lived was not worth living, so I changed it. And I feel like that right now. I still find myself whining and complaining sometimes, and I have to change that. And Carlos says, but I'm happy with my life, Don Juan. Why should I have to change? Carlos isn't happy with his life. If he were happy, he wouldn't be so easily disturbed or triggered. Reality would not be such a shock to his system. And then Don Juan asks suddenly, do you think that you and I are equals? And Carlos has this physical reaction to this, and he says it's like a sound of metal clashing. And so here he's being faced with something serious. And the clash he hears or feels, I think, is due to reality being dashed, or his false beliefs that he doesn't want to let go of being dashed. Reality is shattering his false beliefs. I don't think he ever really believes he's superior. He just puts on the air that he's superior without ever really believing it. And he says, of course we're equals. And he says that he was being condescending, and he thinks he's superior because he's had education, he's from the city. But Carlos is a pretender, and he actually looks down on Don Juan. He's come to Don Juan to teach him, and yet he still feels a need to feel superior. He claims to take pride in being a student, yet he's failing at being a student under Don Juan's teachings. This is an issue I've faced as a coach and a trainer, where students want to come in and feel not always just superior to me, but like I'll notice maybe they have a brother or a friend or a sibling that has, or a cousin that has some talent too, and I'll say, oh, you should bring them in and let them, you guys can build each other up. But they don't want to do that because they want to feel superior to their cousin. They want to be able to beat up their cousin or their friend or their brother or whatever. And there's no humbleness in them whatsoever. And so they fail to ever really learn anything. And in the past, I've taken pride in my studiousness too, and it's cost me a great deal. So I've been guilty of that too. And then Don Juan looks at him and says, "No, we're not equal. I'm a hunter and a warrior, and you are a pimp." And this shocks Carlos like to his core, and he drops his notes. And yeah, it's true. Carlos touts other people's opinions and manipulates others in order to direct them towards beliefs about the world that aren't even his own. He wants Don Juan's knowledge so he can sell it to the world. And Don Juan even has to physically show Carlos, like, if you want to go get plants, you have to physically go get plants. And so Don Juan, or Carlos, wants to use Don Juan's body to sell to others as well. And Carlos is willing to lie and manipulate in order to do it. Even his emotions aren't real. As I read the story, many times Carlos's emotions are only meant to manipulate Don Juan. Even his irritation, anger, sadness, even when he expresses positivity, many times it's only meant to manipulate the situation. His acts, feelings, and decisions are not his own. And in the end, Don Juan demonstrates, likely entirely unintentionally, how precise and powerful his way of life is. After he's told Carlos that he's a pimp, and his actions aren't his own, Carlos is all torn up inside, and as Carlos's mind is going a mile a minute, and he has to move around, and he feels separate from reality, a reality that he he literally can't see because it's describing the situation and it's getting darker and darker, and Don Juan's silhouette is fading and he's disappearing into the background. And here's another example. You know, Carlos is so obsessed with like what he can see and what he can say, but this is symbolic of how you can't see a thing or you can't put it into words and describe it, yet it's right in front of you. It's right there. So much so that Carlos has to reach out and touch reality. He has to make sure that it's real because he's just, in his life, he's so adverse to reality. He's so much trying to put off reality. So he reaches out and touches Don Juan, and he is overcome with the emotion at having come in contact with the power of reality manifest in Don Juan. So this has been Learning to Hunt from Journey to Ixtlan by Carlos Castaneda. I'm Coach Brian with Northwest Elite Spirit. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. Like, comment, share, and of course, practice. You can find access to my suggested library, my blog, my Northwest Elite Spirit shop, and Northwest Elite Spirit Elite Athlete and Performer paid programs on northwestelitespirit.com. You can also find Northwest Elite Spirit on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Thank you.